May 27, 1941. 8:47 hours, 400 miles west of Brest. North Atlantic Sea, Captain Ernst Lindemann stood on what remained of Bismarck's bridge, watching British battleships close from three directions through smoke and spray. His ship, the unsinkable ship, the invincible ship, the pride of the Kriegsmarine, was listing badly to port. Engines dead, steering gone. Fires burning through half her length. Around him, the last functional gun. Crews fired wildly at shapes they could barely see. Through the smoke, the British shells came in methodical salvos, one every 20 seconds, each one landing closer than the last. Professional, relentless, certain. Lindemann had commanded Bismarck for 9 months. He'd watched her launch to fanfare, seen Hitler himself christen her Germany's new weapon of maritime dominance, heard gross Admiral Reeder promise she would sweep the Atlantic clean of British shipping. The propaganda had been explicit. Bismarck was more than a battleship. She was proof of German engineering superiority, a floating fortress that no enemy could touch. 3 days ago, Lindemann had believed it. His ship had destroyed HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy. In 8 minutes, one lucky salvo, and Britain's most famous warship had exploded and sank, taking 1,415 men to the bottom. The crew had cheered, Berlin had celebrated. The invincible ship had proven herself invincible. Now, 72 hours later, Bismarck was dying by degrees under the guns of ships she'd been built to outfight. And the British weren't hurrying. They were simply doing what had to be done with the same methodical precision they'd shown for 3 centuries of naval warfare. A shell struck Bismarck's forward superstructure. Lindemann felt the deck shudder beneath his feet. Through the smoke, he could see HMS Rodney adjusting her aim, her 16-inch guns tracking with glacial patience. No rush, no panic, just the steady work of killing a ship that wouldn't die easily. This wasn't how the story was supposed to end. The invincible ship, Bismarck, had been designed as Germany's answer to British naval supremacy, a warship so powerful that her mere existence would force the Royal Navy to completely reorganize its Atlantic strategy. Launched in Hamburg on Valentine's Day 1939, she displaced 5,300 tons, fully loaded, mounted 8 15-inch guns in 4 turrets, and carried armor protection that German engineers claimed made her virtually unsinkable. Her armored belt was 310 cm thick, over a foot of hardened steel, protecting her vital spaces. Her horizontal deck armor could withstand bombs. Her compartmentalized hull could survive multiple torpedo hits. The numbers told a story of overwhelming power. Main armament, 8 15-inch guns. Range 36,000 meters. Secondary armament, 12 5.9-inch guns, 14 4.1-inch guns, 16 37mm anti-aircraft guns. Armor 320 m belts, 120 m deck, 360 m turret faces. Speed 30 knots, maximum crew 2,200 officers and men. Cost 196.8 million Reichsmarks. The most expensive warship Germany had ever built. German propaganda made Bismarck larger than life. Newsreels showed her launching to massive crowds. Hitler himself standing in the reviewing stand. Radio broadcasts called her The ship that cannot be sunk. Sailors wrote home about serving aboard Germany's new Queen of the Seas. The mythology built quickly. Bismarck wasn't just a weapon. She was a symbol of the Third Reich's engineering genius and military inevitability. Forgotten Captain Hans Ritter, Bismarck's gunnery officer, captured the mood in a letter to his wife. Before the ship's maiden combat operation, "We sailed tomorrow for destiny. This ship is a fortress. The British may come with their entire fleet, and we will send them all to the bottom. Germany has finally built a weapon worthy of ruling the Atlantic." The British reading intercepted communications, and intelligence reports knew Bismarck was formidable. But they also knew something the Germans had forgotten: that the North Atlantic had been Britain's domain for 300 years, and that naval warfare wasn't decided by armor, thickness, or gun caliber. It was decided by seamanship, patience, and the willingness to hunt an enemy until there was nowhere left to run. The death of Hood, May 24, 1941, Denmark. Strait between Iceland and Greenland. HMS Hood, Britain's largest and most famous warship, met Bismarck and her escort, the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, in cold northern waters, where visibility shifted between fog banks and clear morning light. Hood was a legend. Launched in 1918, she'd spent 2 decades as the Royal Navy's flagship, touring the world as a symbol of British naval power. Sailors called her the Mighty Hood. She was fast, elegant, and carried 8 15-inch guns. That had made her the most powerful warship afloat for over 20 years. But Hood had a weakness. Her deck armor was thin, designed in an era when naval battles were fought at close range, where shells struck ships horizontally rather than plunging down from high angles. By 1941, with guns that could fire 30,000 meters, that design was obsolete. Hood's protection worked only if enemies stayed close. The battle began at WWII, 2 hours range, approximately 26.0 meters. Both sides opened fire within minutes. British shells fell around Bismarck, several striking home, but failing to penetrate her heavy armor. German shells straddled Hood, walking closer with each salvo. At 600 hours, Bismarck's 5th salvo struck Hood amidships. 1 or more shells penetrated her thin deck armor, reached her main ammunition magazines, and detonated 100 tons of cordite propellant. The explosion was visible for 20 miles. Hood's back broke. Her bow and stern lifted simultaneously as the center section disintegrated in flame, and steel fragments she sank in less than 3 minutes, taking all but 3 of her 418-man crew to the bottom. The watching Germans couldn't believe what they'd witnessed. 1 salvo, 1 lucky penetration, and Britain's proudest warship had simply ceased to exist. Aboard Bismarck, the crew cheered wildly. They'd done what German propaganda promised: destroyed the symbol of British naval dominance. In a single morning, Berlin would celebrate. The Führer would be pleased. Bismarck had proven herself invincible on her first day of combat. But aboard HMS Prince of Wales, Hood's escort, which had withdrawn after taking damage, the mood was different. Officers and men stood in shocked silence, staring at the patch of burning oil where Hood had been. Then quietly, they began making preparations. They sent contact reports. They shadowed Bismarck. They waited for reinforcements. The British weren't panicking. They were calculating. And what they calculated was simple. Bismarck had just signed her own death warrant. Sink the Bismarck. The news of Hood's destruction reached London. Within hours, the shock was profound. Hood had been more than a ship. She'd been a floating piece of Britain itself. A symbol that had represented the empire for a generation. Winston Churchill received the report at Chequers. He read it once, set it down, and gave an order that would mobilize nearly every capital ship the Royal Navy had. In the Atlantic sink the Bismarck. It wasn't revenge, it was necessity. Bismarck loose in the Atlantic was an existential threat. She could raid convoys, destroy escorts, force Britain to completely reorganize its shipping protection. Every merchant ship crossing the Atlantic with food and supplies would be at risk. The lifeline that kept Britain in the war would be cut. More fundamentally, Hood's loss could not stand unanswered. If Bismarck escaped to occupied France, if she survived her first operation, the blow to British morale and prestige would be catastrophic. The Royal Navy had lost battles before, but it had never allowed an enemy capital ship to sink its flagship and escape unpunished. The order went out from the Admiralty. Every available ship was to convert on Bismarck's last known position. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, even the aircraft carrier HMS Royal, operating hundreds of miles to the south, turned toward the Denmark Strait. Admiral John Tovey, commanding the home fleet from HMS King George V, studied his charts and made his calculations. Bismarck had damaged Prince of Wales, but had taken 3 shell hits herself. One had ruptured a fuel tank, leaving a telltale oil slick. She was leaking fuel and would need to make port for repairs. That meant Brest or Saint-Nazaire, German-controlled ports in occupied France. It meant Bismarck would head south, trying to reach safety before British forces could concentrate against her. It meant the Royal Navy had perhaps 48 hours to find her and bring her to battle before she reached air cover and shore-based protection. Tovey's force included King George V and Rodney, both carrying 16-inch guns that could match Bismarck's firepower, plus the battle cruiser Renown, the carrier Royal, and multiple cruisers and destroyers. If they could find Bismarck, they could kill her. The question was finding her. The North Atlantic was vast. Weather was deteriorating, and Bismarck had already disappeared into fog banks. That made radar contact intermittent at best. But the British had one advantage the Germans hadn't considered: patience. The Royal Navy had been hunting enemies across oceans. For 3 centuries, they knew how to track, how to predict, how to wait for the moment when geography and fuel state would force their quarry into a position. With no escape, they would find Bismarck. And then they would finish what Hood had started. The hunt for 31 hours. Bismarck vanished. British cruisers lost radar contact in heavy weather. Search aircraft found nothing but empty ocean. German wireless traffic suggested Bismarck was making for France, but intercepts couldn't pinpoint her location. Tovey's force steamed southeast. calculating probable courses. But the ocean was too large and Bismarck too fast. Aboard the German battleship, Lindemann made decisions that would prove fatal. He detached Prince Eugen to operate independently. He maintained radio silence, except for periodic status reports to Berlin. Transmissions that British direction-finding stations logged and triangulated. He ran at economical speed to conserve damaged fuel tanks, heading for the French coast, where Luftwaffe air cover could protect him. During the final approach, everything seemed to be working. The British had lost him. Another day and he'd be in port under repair, ready to sail again once Bismarck was fully operational. Then on May 26th at 10:30 hours, a Catalina flying boat from Coastal Command spotted an oil slick. The pilot followed it northeast, through broken clouds, until he saw Bismarck below him, steaming steadily toward France, still 700 miles from safety, but making good progress. The pilot transmitted his sighting report and began shadowing. Bismarck's anti-aircraft guns opened fire, but the Catalina stayed out of range, circling, reporting position updates every 30 minutes. Admiral Tovey received the contact report. Aboard King George V, he plotted Bismarck's position, calculated courses and speeds, and recognized immediately that his battleships were too far away. Even at maximum speed, he wouldn't intercept before Bismarck reached French air cover. But Ark Royal, operating with Force H to the south, was within striking range. If her aircraft could slow Bismarck down, damage her steering or propulsion, then Tovey's heavy units could catch up and finish her. The order went out: attack. At dusk, the Swordfish, HMS Ark Royal, pitched heavily in rough seas, as deck crews prepared 15 ferry Swordfish torpedo bombers for launch. The Swordfish was obsolete, a biplane design from the 1930s, fabric-covered slow, carrying a single 18-inch torpedo. German fighter pilots called them flying coffins. They looked like they belonged in the First World War. Not the Second, but they had one advantage. They were too slow for modern fire control systems to track effectively. Bismarck's anti-aircraft guns, designed to engage modern aircraft flying at 300 knots, struggled to aim at Swordfish, plodding through the air at 90 knots. The strike launched at 2,050 hours into deteriorating weather and fading light. Pilots flew low over gray waves, navigating by dead reckoning, searching for a ship that would be nearly invisible against the darkening ocean. They found her at 2,053 hours. Bismarck's massive silhouette, emerging from rain squalls, anti-aircraft guns already firing. The Swordfish split up, attacking from multiple directions to divide the defensive fire. Traces arced through the sky. Shells burst around the slow-moving aircraft. One Swordfish took hits and dropped away. Trailing smoke, the rest pressed their attacks. Torpedoes dropped, hitting the water, running straight toward their target. Most missed or struck armor, too thick to penetrate. But one, launched by Sublieutenant John Moffett from 50 meters altitude, struck Bismarck's stern quarter at 21:15 hours. The explosion jammed her rudder hard to port. Damage control teams fought to regain steering control, but the rudder was locked in place, unmovable. Bismarck began turning in slow circles, Her engines still worked, her guns still fired. But she couldn't steer, couldn't maintain course toward France, couldn't maneuver to avoid enemy ships, couldn't do anything but spiral helplessly, while British battleships closed from the northwest. Lindemann stood on the wrecked bridge, watching his ship turn against his will, and understood what had happened. One torpedo, one single lucky hit from an obsolete biplane, had crippled the unsinkable ship. The mathematics of pursuit had shifted instantly. Bismarck's speed no longer mattered. If she couldn't steer, he composed a message to Berlin. Ship unmaneuverable, will fight to the last shell. The final battle. Dawn on May 27th came grey and cold over heavy seas. Bismarck had spent the night attempting repairs, trying everything to regain steering control. Nothing worked, she could only manage slow circles, heading generally northwest, away from France toward the British forces hunting her. At 8:43 hours, lookouts spotted masts on the horizon. Minutes later, HMS Rodney and King George the Fifth emerged from morning haze. Already at battle stations, main guns trained forward. Admiral Tovey had closed during the night, using radar to track Bismarck's erratic course. Now with daylight and calm tactical positioning, he had exactly what he needed. 2 British battleships against 1 German ship that couldn't maneuver. The mathematics were brutal. British firepower, 18 heavy guns, 9/16-inch on Rodney, 10/14-inch on King George V. German firepower, 6 operational heavy guns, 2 turrets damaged, 1 turret unmanned. British mobility, full steering control. Perfect positioning, German mobility. Non-locked rudder, unable to maneuver or escape. At 8:47 hours, Rodney opened fire at 23,000 meters. King George V followed. Seconds later, heavy cruisers, Norfolk and Dorsetshire, closed from the east, adding their 8-inch guns. Bismarck's forward turrets returned fire. Her first salvos were accurate. 1 shell landed close aboard Rodney, sending water cascading across her decks. German gunnery was still professional, still dangerous, but the British had position and numbers. Their shells fell in steady patterns, walking closer with each salvo. Bracket corrections called calmly from each ship's fire control station. When they found the range, they simply kept firing. The punishment was methodical. British shells struck Bismarck's superstructure, penetrated her armor, destroyed her gun directors, silenced her turrets one by one. Fires burned through her upper works. Her forward turrets ceased firing. Crews dead, ammunition hoists destroyed, targeting systems wrecked. She fought back with whatever remained. Secondary guns fired at cruisers. Anti-aircraft weapons engaged. When British destroyers closed to torpedo range, individual sailors manned guns manually. When fire control systems failed, but it was hopeless, a crippled ship, being systematically destroyed by enemies who could position themselves at will and fire until their ammunition ran out. Tovey observed from King George V's bridge, watching his ship's work. There was no triumph in his voice when he spoke, only flat assessment of tactical reality. "She's putting up a brave fight," he remarked to his staff, then without emotion, "Continue firing." The British didn't hate Bismarck's crew. They respected them. These were professional sailors, fighting with courage and skill. against impossible odds, but respect didn't mean mercy. Hood's crew deserved accounting. Britain's Atlantic lifeline required security. The job would be finished. For 6 hours, British guns fired into Bismarck's dying hull. Her speed dropped to 7 knots. Her list increased fires burned unchecked. Bodies littered her decks. Yet she wouldn't sink. Her armor was too strong. Her compartmentalization too effective. She could be destroyed, but she couldn't be sunk simply by gunfire. At 10:15 hours, Tovey made his decision. Torpedo her. HMS Dorsetshire closed to 3.0 meters and launched torpedoes into Bismarck's port side. 2 struck home minutes later. Dorsetshire circled and launched torpedoes into her starboard side. 1 hit at 10:36 hours. Bismarck rolled to Porter. Crew, though still alive, jumped into the freezing Atlantic. She capsized completely, floated upside down for a moment, then slipped beneath the waves. Stern first, the ocean went quiet. British sailors lined their ship's rails, standing at attention as their enemy sank. No one cheered. Naval tradition demanded respect for brave opponents. These German sailors had fought well. They'd simply fought for the wrong cause, in a ship that couldn't escape fate. The survivors, Dorsetshire and destroyer Maori, began pulling German sailors from the water. Men clinging to wreckage covered in oil, hypothermic from the North Atlantic's cold. They pulled aboard 110 men before a U-boat alarm forced them to withdraw. The destroyers departed at speed, leaving hundreds of German sailors still in the water. 2 scattered to rescue before darkness and weather killed them. Of Bismarck's 22-man crew, only 114 survived. The rest went down with their ship or died in the water afterward, drowned, frozen, pulled under by the weight of their own equipment. Among the survivors was machinist Bruno Zonka, who'd been blown overboard by a shell explosion. British sailors pulled him aboard. Dorsetshire stripped his oil-soaked clothing, wrapped him in blankets, gave him hot tea. Zonka sat shivering on the destroyer's deck, watching other survivors being hauled aboard. Young men like himself, shocked and exhausted, unable to process what had happened. The unsinkable ship had sunk. Their invincible fortress had been destroyed. Everything they'd believed about German superiority and British weakness had proven false. A British sailor offered Razonka a cigarette. Razonka stared at it, then at the sailor's face, expecting hatred, abuse, revenge for Hood. Instead, the British sailor just looked tired. He lit Razonka's cigarette, nodded and moved on to help other survivors. Later, during interrogation, Razonka was asked what he remembered most clearly from Bismarck's final hours. He thought carefully before answering. The British never stopped. They didn't rage or boast or celebrate. They just kept firing, kept adjusting, kept working professional, calm, like they were solving a mathematics problem that had only one solution. We thought our ship was invincible, but they just treated her like any other target. Difficult, yes, but ultimately just another ship that could be sunk if you worked hard enough. The reckoning. News of Bismarck's sinking reached Berlin on May 27th, interrupting lunch at Hitler's field headquarters. The Führer received the report in silence, read it twice, then dismissed his staff without comment. German propaganda struggled to explain how the unsinkable ship had been sunk, how the pride of the Kriegsmarine had been destroyed. After just 9 days at sea, radio broadcasts emphasized the brave fight, the damage inflicted on British forces, the heroism of the crew. They didn't mention that Bismarck had accomplished almost nothing. She'd sunk one ship, damaged another, then been hunted down and killed before she could threaten a single convoy. The British didn't gloat. Churchill addressed Parliament with measured words. The Royal Navy has once again demonstrated that control of the seas cannot be wrested from us by building larger ships or thicker armor. It requires seamanship, determination, and the willingness to hunt an enemy across thousands of miles until the task is completed. For the Royal Navy, Bismarck's destruction restored something intangible, but vital proof that British sea power remained supreme, that Hood's loss had been avenged, that no German ship could operate in the Atlantic without being hunted down and destroyed. Admiral Tovey, in his official report, made no mention of revenge or triumph. He noted only that Bismarck put up a most gallant fight against impossible odds, worthy of the old days of the German Imperial Navy, and she went down with her colors flying. This was British naval tradition. Respect for enemies who fought bravely, even while destroying them utterly. The strength wasn't in celebrating victory. It was in maintaining professional standards, while achieving it the empty ocean. By midday on May 27th, the North Atlantic had returned to its usual gray vastness. The British ships formed up and headed back to Scapa Flow. The survivors were transferred to other vessels for transport to prisoner of war camps. The ocean covered Bismarck's grave with waves that would conceal her wreck. For 48 years, the Germans built no more Bismarcks. Tirpitz, her sister ship, spent most of the war hiding in Norwegian fjords, tied down by the mere threat of Royal Navy response, eventually sunk by British bombers, without ever engaging in a major fleet action. The lesson was clear: building large, powerful ships wasn't enough. Naval warfare required seamanship coordination, patience, and the institutional knowledge that came from 3 centuries of ruling the waves. Germany had industrial might. Britain had naval tradition. In the end, tradition won. For the 114 German survivors who'd been aboard that unsinkable ship when she died, captivity brought time to reflect on what they'd witnessed. Many, like Bruno Rizonga, struggled to reconcile German propaganda with British reality. They'd expected monsters and found professionals. They'd anticipated revenge and received correct treatment under the laws of war. One survivor, in a letter written from a Scottish POW camp, tried to explain it to his family. "We were told the British would be cruel, that their empire was built on brutality, that they'd lost the moral strength to fight wars properly, but when they pulled me from the water, they gave me blankets and tea. When they interrogated me, they were firm but fair. They treated us like defeated enemies, not like criminals, and when they sank our ship, they did it because it was their duty, not because they hated us, but because we were dangerous and needed to be stopped." That kind of strength to destroy an enemy without descending into cruelty, is something we never understood in Germany. The closing, May 28, 1941. Skagerrak, Orkney Islands. HMS King George V. Anchored in the grey waters of Britain's main naval base, returning to port after 3 days of continuous steaming and 6 hours of battle. Sailors lined her decks, watching the Scottish coast emerge through morning mist. No bunting decorated the ship. No crowds waited on the pier. The crew had done their duty, hunted an enemy, brought her to battle, destroyed her, and now they would resume the endless work of convoy protection, an Atlantic patrol that kept Britain supplied. And in the war, Admiral Tovey stood on King George Nathan's Bridge, looking out at the assembled home fleet. Hood was gone, her crew still entombed in Denmark Strait. But Bismarck was gone too, sent to the bottom by the same professional seamanship that had ruled these waters. Since Nelson's day, the Germans had built a ship designed to challenge British naval supremacy. They'd made her powerful fast, heavily armored. They'd called her unsinkable and proclaimed her the new queen of the seas. But they'd forgotten what the British had learned over centuries, that controlling the ocean wasn't about building the biggest ship. It was about having the patience to hunt, the skill to find, and the determination to finish what you started, regardless of how long it took or how far you had to steam. Bismarck was powerful, the Royal Navy was relentless. In 6 hours of methodical gunfire, Relentless had proven stronger than powerful. The ocean had decided, as it always did, who truly ruled its waves. And on that grey Atlantic morning, watching another German warship slip beneath the surface, the British had done what they'd done for 300 years. Their duty professionally and without fuss. Because that's what sailors of the Royal Navy had always done and would continue doing until the war was won. The waves rolled on, cold and grey and endless. Somewhere far below, Bismarck settled on the ocean floor, a monument to German engineering and a testament to British resolve. Above, the surface returned to its usual emptiness, unmarked except by the oil slicks and debris that would disperse. Within hours, nothing remained but the memory and the lesson that power without wisdom is temporary, but tradition and patience endure. The Germans had boasted their ship was unsinkable. The British had simply sunk her.